March 6, 1944. Shortly after noon, the temperature at 25,000 feet was -40 degrees. 700 heavy bombers crossed into German airspace, their contrails stretching across the winter sky like white scars. The drone of nearly 3,000 radial engines filled the frozen air as the formations pressed eastward, deeper into enemy territory than American bombers had ever successfully penetrated in daylight. They were headed for Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, a target that American planners had dreamed of striking since the war began. But this mission was different from those that had come before. Flying alongside the bombers, weaving through the formations with fuel to spare, were sleek silver fighters with distinctive bubble canopies and squared-off wing-tips. Their pilots scanned the horizon with practiced eyes, watching for the telltale black specks that meant German interceptors were climbing to attack. They were P-51 Mustangs, and they had come to hunt. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters scrambled from airfields across Germany, their pilots determined to defend their capital. What followed was one of the largest air battles of the war. By the time the last American bomber turned for home, dozens of German fighters lay scattered across the frozen landscape. The exchange rate was devastating. For every American fighter lost, the Germans had lost multiple aircraft, and the pilots, the irreplaceable men who flew those German machines, were dying faster than they could be trained. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had once boasted that if enemy bombs ever fell on Berlin, the German people could call him Meyer. Now, watching American fighters circle freely over his capital, he understood that something fundamental had changed. In his post-war interrogation, Göring would call the long-range escort fighter one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. When those fighters appeared over Berlin, he admitted, he knew the results would be tragic for Germany. The P-51 Mustang had arrived too late to prevent years of slaughter, but it had arrived in time to end it. This is the story of an aircraft that was rejected by the very nation it would save. It is the story of a self-taught immigrant engineer who designed one of history's greatest weapons in just over 3 months. It is the story of a British engine married to an American airframe, creating a machine that could fly further, faster, and fight harder than anything else in the sky. And it is the story of how that machine broke the back of the Luftwaffe, killing German pilots faster than they could be replaced, until the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies alone. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation and defiance in equal measure. By the spring of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of France was ending in catastrophe, and the evacuation at Dunkirk had saved lives but lost equipment. British aircraft factories were working around the clock, but they could barely replace the Hurricanes and Spitfires being lost in combat. The Royal Air Force needed more fighters, and it needed them fast. The British Purchasing Commission, led by Sir Henry Self, operated from offices in New York City with a simple mission: buy American aircraft, build British strength. They approached North American Aviation with what seemed like a straightforward request. The company should manufacture Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license, since Curtiss could not meet demand for its own design. It was a reasonable ask. North American Aviation was known for building excellent trainers and the new B-25 Mitchell bomber. They had the factory capacity. They had the workforce. All they needed to do was follow someone else's blueprints. James H. Kindelberger had other ideas. They called him Dutch, this son of a West Virginia steelworker who had dropped out of high school at 16. Through correspondence courses and wartime pilot training, Kindelberger had risen to become one of the most capable aircraft executives in America. He had led development of the DC-1 and DC-2 at Douglas Aircraft before taking over North American Aviation in 1934. He knew good aircraft design when he saw it. And he knew the P-40, while capable, was not the future. Kindelberger made a counter-proposal that would change the course of aviation history. Rather than building an already dated design, he told Self that North American could design and build a completely new fighter using the same Allison engine. They could do it faster than setting up a P-40 production line, and it would be better than anything else in the sky. Self was skeptical. North American Aviation had never designed a frontline fighter. But Kindelberger was persuasive, and the British were desperate. A letter of intent was signed on April 10, 1940. A firm order for 320 aircraft followed on May 29, at a unit cost not exceeding $40,000. The total contract value came to just under $15 million. Now, Kindelberger needed someone to actually design the aircraft. He turned to his chief preliminary design engineer, a quiet man with an Austrian accent and no formal engineering degree. His name was Edgar Schmued. Schmued had been born on December 30th, 1899, in Hornbach, Bavaria. He held Austrian citizenship through his father. He had never attended engineering school. Instead, he had apprenticed in a German engine factory as a teenager, served as a mechanic in the Austro-Hungarian aviation troops during the First World War, and taught himself aeronautical engineering through relentless study and practical experience. He emigrated to Brazil in 1925, then reached the United States in 1931. That year, fewer than 800 Austrians were admitted to America, and Schmued was among them. He joined North American Aviation and worked his way up through sheer brilliance. When Kindelberger asked if North American should build P-40s, Schmued's response was characteristically direct. He said they should not build an obsolete airplane, they should build a new one. They could design and build something better. What followed was one of the most remarkable achievements in aviation history. The deadline was impossibly tight. Most aircraft designs took years to move from concept to prototype. Schmued had been given months. He gathered a team of engineers and draftsmen and set them to work on double shifts. The design office at Inglewood became a hive of activity around the clock, with men sleeping on cots beside their drawing boards and eating meals at their desks. Schmued and his team incorporated breakthrough innovations that would define fighter aircraft design for a generation. The wing used a laminar flow airfoil profile developed from research conducted by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. By placing maximum thickness far aft along the chord, roughly 40 to 50% back from the leading edge, the design maintained smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing surface. This dramatically reduced drag. Wind tunnel tests at the University of Washington confirmed clear superiority over conventional airfoils used in existing fighters. The cooling system was equally revolutionary. Most fighters of the era used forward-mounted radiators that created substantial drag. Schmued positioned a ventral radiator beneath the rear fuselage and ducted it to exploit what engineers called the Meredith effect. As air passed through the radiator, it absorbed heat from the engine coolant and expanded. The hot air exiting the duct produced slight jet thrust that partially offset the cooling drag. Some engineers estimated this effect recovered as much as 300 horsepower worth of drag at high speeds. The fuselage itself was mathematically calculated using conic sections, producing exceptionally smooth surfaces that further reduced drag. Every rivet was flush-mounted, every panel joint was filled and smoothed. The attention to aerodynamic detail was obsessive, and the entire airframe was designed in 5 pre-fitted sections for efficient mass manufacturing, allowing unskilled workers to assemble aircraft at rates that would have been impossible with conventional construction methods. On September 9, 1940, just 102 days after design work began, the NA-73X prototype rolled out of the North American factory at Inglewood, California. The engine had not yet arrived, but the airframe was complete. The commonly cited 120-day promise had been beaten by nearly 3 weeks. Test pilot Vance Breeze made the maiden flight on October 26, 1940, at Mines Field in Los Angeles. The first flight lasted approximately 5 minutes. A second flight of about 10 minutes followed the same day. Breeze flew the prototype 7 times over the following weeks, accumulating roughly 3.5 hours of flight time. His reports were enthusiastic. The aircraft handled beautifully. Then came near disaster. On November 20, 1940, North American's chief test pilot, Paul Balfour, took the prototype up. Schmued offered to brief him on the aircraft's systems. Balfour declined, reportedly saying that one airplane is like another. After approximately 12 minutes of flight, the Allison engine quit. Balfour was too far from Mines Field to return. He put the aircraft down in a ploughed field, where the wheels dug into soft soil and the prototype flipped upside down. Balfour crawled out unhurt, but the aircraft was badly damaged. The setback could have ended the program. Instead, North American rebuilt the prototype. Robert C. Chilton, hired as the new chief test pilot, flew the repaired aircraft on April 3, 1941. The program continued. But there was a problem that no amount of engineering brilliance could solve. The Allison V 1710 engine produced 1,150 horsepower at low altitude, making the new fighter one of the fastest aircraft in the world, below 15,000 feet. It was 30 miles per hour faster than the P-40, using the same engine. It was 35 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mark V at similar altitudes. At sea level, it could outrun both the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. Above 15,000 feet, however, performance fell away dramatically. The Allison engine used a single-speed supercharger optimized for low-altitude operations. The higher the aircraft climbed, the less power the engine could produce, and air combat over Europe was fought at high altitude, where German fighters held every advantage. The United States Army Air Corps showed little interest in fixing this problem. As a condition of granting an export license, the Army required North American to hand over 2 free prototypes. The 4th and 10th airframes were designated XP-51 and shipped to Wright Field in Ohio for evaluation. When North American test pilot Bob Chilton later visited and asked to see the flight log, he received a stunning response. He was told there was no point wasting effort flying the aircraft when there was no plan to purchase any. Major General Oliver Eccles, head of Army Combat Aircraft Procurement, actively obstructed the P-51 program. He preferred the Fisher P-75 Eagle, which would ultimately prove unsuccessful. He wanted North American focused on trainers and bombers. He reportedly slowed Allison engine deliveries to North American, causing completed airframes to pile up without powerplants. The aircraft that would save the American bombing campaign was being rejected by the American military. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force eagerly adopted the new fighter. They designated it the Mustang Mark I and assigned it to Army Cooperation Command for low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The first Mustangs arrived in Britain in October 1941. Number 26, Squadron at Gatwick, began operations in early 1942, Flying Officer G.N. Dawson flew the first operational sortie on May 10, 1942, strafing hangars and a train near the French coast. During the Dieppe raid, on August 19, 1942, 4 Mustang squadrons flew tactical reconnaissance. Flying Officer Hollis Hills, an American volunteer serving with the Royal Canadian Air Force, scored the first ever Mustang air-to-air victory, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190. The aircraft was proving its worth, but everyone who flew it knew the same thing. With a different engine, it could be so much more. The man who would prove that point was a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald W. Harker. On April 30, 1942, Harker visited the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford at the invitation of Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord. He flew Mustang Mark I serial AG 422 for approximately 30 minutes. The aircraft was already 35 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mark V at comparable power settings, but above 15,000 feet, performance dropped away badly. The next day, Harker wrote a formal memorandum to his superiors at Rolls-Royce. He stated that the aircraft could prove itself a formidable low and medium altitude fighter. But the point which struck him most was that with a powerful and good engine like the Merlin 61, its performance could be outstanding. Harker was not the first person to suggest mating the Mustang airframe with the Merlin engine. Representatives from the British Air Commission and some American officials had floated the idea as early as April 1941, but Harker's advocacy became the catalyst that moved the program forward. Rolls-Royce General Manager Ernest Hives championed the proposal, telephoning Air Vice Marshal Wilfred Freeman immediately after receiving Harker's report. By early June 1942, formal approval was granted. Rolls-Royce began converting 5 Mustang airframes at Hucknall Aerodrome. The first Mustang X, fitted with a Merlin 65 engine and a 4-bladed Rotol propeller, flew on October 13, 1942. Captain R.T. Shepard was at the controls. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The converted aircraft achieved 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. Its absolute ceiling reached 40,600 feet. The 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger of the Merlin maintained power at altitudes where the single-stage Allison had been gasping. The numbers told the story. The Merlin 65 developed over 1,300 horsepower at high altitude, maintaining its power where combat actually occurred. The Allison produced only 1,150 horsepower at just 11,800 feet. At the altitudes where the air war over Europe was actually being fought, the Merlin-powered Mustang was a completely different aircraft. Simultaneously, North American Aviation pursued its own conversion using the Packard V-1650, an American license-built version of the Merlin manufactured in Detroit. A key champion of this effort was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr., the United States Assistant Military Attaché in London. Hitchcock was America's most famous polo player, so celebrated that he had inspired a character in a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He had served in the Lafayette Flying Corps during the First World War and escaped German captivity by jumping from a moving train. Now he lobbied Washington relentlessly for the Merlin Mustang. Hitchcock wrote that the Mustang had been sired by the English out of an American mother. It had no parent in the Air Force to appreciate and push its good points. He would not live to see his efforts vindicated. Hitchcock was killed on April 18, 1944, while testing a P-51 with drop tanks. He died just 49 days before D-Day. In August 1942, the United States Army Air Forces ordered 400 P-51Bs before any American-built Merlin-powered Mustang had even flown. It was an extraordinary display of confidence. The XP-51B prototype made its first flight on November 30, 1942, with Bob Chilton at the controls. He skipped speed runs and headed straight for altitude, climbing past 30,000 feet as the automatic supercharger gear engaged. The transformation was complete. The P-51B entered production in May 1943. Nearly 2,000 were built at Inglewood, California, with another 1,750 P-51Cs, identical aircraft, rolling off the line at Dallas, Texas. The Packard V-1653 engine, based on the Merlin 63, and powered these early models. The improved V-1657, equivalent to the Merlin 66, and producing 1,490 horsepower normal and 1,720 horsepower at war emergency power, would power the definitive P-51D, but the true revolution was range. Internal fuel capacity grew from 184 gallons in wing tanks to 269 gallons, with the addition of an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot. External drop tanks multiplied range even further. 75-gallon metal drop tanks provided approximately 1,300 miles total range. 108-gallon paper drop tanks, made from glue-impregnated craft paper and developed by Bowater Lloyd of London, extended range to approximately 1,650 miles. 110-gallon metal drop tanks pushed maximum range to nearly 2,000 miles. The paper drop tanks were a remarkable innovation. Over 15,000 were used by the 8th Air Force without a single reported failure, despite the Wright Field testing facility declaring them unfeasible. Combined with the Mustang's exceptional fuel efficiency, roughly twice that of the P-47 Thunderbolt, this enabled escort missions to Berlin and back. The round trip was approximately 1,120 miles. Only the P-51 could make that flight with fuel remaining for combat. As one American general put it, the Merlin Mustang had the three qualities most needed for escorting bombers to Berlin. Those qualities were range, range, and range. While North American engineers perfected the Mustang, the 8th Air Force was being destroyed over Germany. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing had been built on a deadly assumption. American planners believed that formations of B-17 flying fortresses, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, could defend themselves against fighter attack. The bomber would always get through. Fighters were unnecessary. This belief was about to be tested to destruction. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid on August 17, 1943, sent 376 B-17s against ball-bearing factories and Messerschmitt production facilities deep inside Germany. The Schweinfurt force was over German territory for 3 hours and 30 minutes. Of that time, 2 hours and 10 minutes passed with no fighter escort whatsoever. The escort fighters simply lacked the range to accompany the bombers beyond the German border. American crews flew alone into a killing ground. Combined losses for the day reached approximately 60 B-17s destroyed. The 91st Bomb Group lost 43% of its crews. The 381st Bomb Group lost 50%. 600 trained airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. It would prove to be one of the darkest days in the history of American military aviation. Of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down outright, and 17 more were damaged beyond repair. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 of 15 aircraft dispatched. 130 men, representing an 87% casualty rate in a single unit. Entire crews simply vanished from squadron rosters, their empty bunks a constant reminder of the cost. The bombers had flown without fighter escort for most of their time over Germany. German fighter controllers tracked the formations on radar and vectored hundreds of interceptors into perfect attack positions. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s queued up in relays, each wave making passes through the bomber formations before breaking off to refuel and rearm and attack again. Some German pilots made 4 or 5 separate attacks during the course of the mission. Total crew losses for the day exceeded 650 men. Some were killed instantly when their aircraft exploded. Others parachuted into captivity. Many were wounded, burned, or suffering from frostbite after bailing out at high altitude without adequate protection. The Luftwaffe lost only 35 to 38 fighters against American claims of 186. The American gunners had overclaimed by a factor of nearly 5, a common phenomenon in the chaos of air combat. The official Army Air Force's history stated the conclusion bluntly. The 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. The doctrine that the bomber would always get through had been tested and found wanting. During the preceding Black Week from October 8th to 14th, 88 B-17s were lost in just 3 days, nearly 900 men. The 100th Bomb Group, known as the Bloody 100th, lost 12 of 13 aircraft on the Munster raid of October 10th. By late 1943, the average B-17 in the 8th Air Force had a life expectancy of just 11 missions. The probability of completing a 25-mission combat tour was approximately 1 in 4. Loss rates for bombers flying without fighter escort were 7 times higher than for escorted formations. Unescorted deep raids into Germany were suspended for 4 months. The strategic bombing campaign had been stopped in its tracks. Everything changed in early 1944. The P-51B arrived in the European theatre in late 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, borrowed from the 9th Air Force, received their aircraft in November and flew their first combat mission on December 1st. The 357th Fighter Group became the first 8th Air Force unit to enter combat with P-51s. When the 4th Fighter Group converted in February 1944, their commander, Colonel Don Blakesley, told his pilots they could learn to fly 51s on the way to the target. General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944. He was already a legend, the leader of the daring Tokyo raid in 1942 that had boosted American morale at the lowest point of the Pacific War. Now he was tasked with saving the strategic bombing campaign from collapse. He arrived at 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe in England and immediately began reviewing tactics and doctrine. Doolittle visited the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command under Major General William Kepner and saw a sign on the wall. It read that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to bring the bombers back alive. This doctrine had governed escort operations since the campaign began. Fighters were required to stay close to the bombers, weaving back and forth above the formations, only breaking away to intercept Germans who were already attacking. The fighters were leashed to the bombers they were protecting. Doolittle told Kepner to take the sign down. That was no longer the mission. Doolittle ordered the sign replaced with new words. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to destroy German fighters. Kepner, who had long chafed under the restrictive close escort doctrine and had argued repeatedly for more aggressive tactics, reportedly tore the original sign down as Doolittle walked out of the room. The change was revolutionary. Rather than weaving protectively alongside lumbering bomber formations, P-51 groups would now range 50 miles ahead of the bomber stream. They would catch German interceptors on the ground during takeoff and landing, when fighters were most vulnerable. They would attack German formations as they climbed to altitude and formed up for their own attacks. After bomb runs, fighters would descend to low altitude and strafe airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and killing ground crews. The bombers themselves became bait, forcing the Luftwaffe to rise and fight in an arena where American pilots held every advantage. Doolittle later called this the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the war. It transformed the escort fighter from a defensive shield into an offensive weapon of attrition. The goal was no longer simply to protect bombers. The goal was to kill German pilots. Operation Argument, known as Big Week, ran from February 20th to 25th, 1944. The 8th Air Force flew over 3,000 bomber sorties. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, added more than 500. They struck Junkers plants at Leipzig, Fokker-Wulf factories at Oschersleben, Messerschmitt facilities at Augsburg and Regensburg, and ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt. Royal Air Force Bomber Command added devastating night raids. The February 24th attack on Schweinfurt demonstrated the transformation. 266 bombers struck the ball-bearing factories with long-range escort. Total losses for the day's multi-target missions came to 44 aircraft. In October 1943, against the same target without escort, the 8th Air Force had lost 60 bombers in a single raid. The difference was the P-51. Allied losses for Big Week totaled roughly 226 bombers and 28 fighters. These were significant numbers, but they represented a much smaller percentage of the now vastly larger attacking force. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed. Approximately 100 German pilots were killed in a single week. This represented 17% of the entire fighter pilot force. The commander of the 1st Fighter Corps, General Joseph Schmued, assessed the situation on February 25th. He concluded that in the long run, German forces were fighting a hopeless battle. The common narrative holds that Big Week devastated German aircraft production. This is actually misleading. Albert Speer's dispersal program actually increased production. Germany built approximately 36,000 aircraft in 1944, with fighter output peaking in September at over 3,000 per month. The factories could be rebuilt. The machines could be replaced. The real damage was pilot attrition. Germany could manufacture aircraft. It could not manufacture experienced pilots. On March 6, 1944, over 700 heavy bombers and more than 800 escort fighters hit Berlin in the first major successful American daylight raid on the German capital. The fighting was intense. American pilots claimed 160 German fighters destroyed, though actual Luftwaffe losses were likely between 60 and 80 aircraft. The Americans lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The round trip of approximately 1,120 miles was a distance only the P-51 could reliably cover with fuel remaining for combat. Forcing the Luftwaffe to defend Berlin was strategically brilliant. Every engagement bled irreplaceable pilots. The monthly loss figures tell the story of a force hemorrhaging to death. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 143 day fighters. In February, 524. In March, 583. In April, 687. In May, 758. Between January and May 1944, out of an average fighter pilot strength of approximately 2,300, a total of over 2,200 pilots were lost. This represented effectively a complete turnover in just 5 months. In April alone, the Luftwaffe wrote off 43% of frontline fighters and lost over 20% of fighter pilots. General Adolf Galland reported to Goering that losses far exceeded the number of replacement pilots being forwarded to frontline units. The pilot attrition triggered a devastating feedback loop that Germany could not escape. Pre-war German fighter pilots had received 150 to 200 hours of flight training. They learned aerobatics, gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics in a methodical program that produced some of the finest pilots in the world. These men had honed their skills over France, over Britain, over the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front. They were experienced, confident, and deadly. By early 1944, training time was compressed to 160 hours, then 112 hours. As instructors were pulled from training schools to replace frontline losses, the remaining teachers were spread thin. New pilots received less individual attention, fewer practice sorties, less time mastering the demanding characteristics of high-performance fighters like the Messerschmitt 109. Some graduates had never fired their guns at an aerial target before their first combat mission. By mid-1944, training had collapsed to as little as 15 to 20 hours on operational aircraft types. New pilots arrived at frontline units barely able to take off and land safely, let alone engage in the violent maneuvering of aerial combat. They had not learned how to check their 6 o'clock for enemy fighters. They had not learned energy management, the art of trading altitude for speed and speed for position. They had not learned to work as wingmen, protecting each other in the chaos of a dogfight. Fuel allocated to training schools plummeted from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to barely 5,000 tons by September. There simply was not enough aviation fuel to train pilots properly and still mount defensive operations. The fuel that did exist was reserved for combat missions, leaving training schools running on fumes. By comparison, American pilots received approximately 300 hours of training or more, with substantial time on operational aircraft types. American fighter pilots arrived in England with more flying time than many Luftwaffe veterans. Poorly trained replacements were easy prey for experienced American pilots. By autumn 1944, the average lifespan of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 8 to 30 days. These young men climbed into their cockpits knowing the odds were against them. Many did not survive their first combat mission. Those who did often lasted only a few more sorties before falling to the guns of Mustang pilots who had been flying and fighting for months. Of the 107 German pilots credited with more than 100 victories, only 8 had entered frontline service after June 1942. The experienced core of the Luftwaffe, the veterans who had built their scores over years of combat, was being annihilated faster than quality replacements could be produced. Germany was bleeding to death in the sky, one pilot at a time. Adolf Galland, the Inspector General of Fighter Forces, described how Goering's headquarters initially denied that long-range fighters could reach Germany at all. Galland and another general personally flew their Focke-Wulf 190s to investigate. The other general was shot down and killed by P-51s. Galland escaped only by firing his guns forward, the smoke causing the American fighters to break off pursuit. Galland later declared that the day the American fighters took the offensive was the day Germany lost the air war. On November 2, 1944, he sent nearly 500 fighters against over 1,000 American bombers, escorted by more than 800 fighters, the majority of them P-51s. The Americans shot down over 130 German fighters and killed more than 70 pilots. The Luftwaffe destroyed fewer than 40 American aircraft in return. The exchange rate was annihilating. Notable German aces fell one after another. Oberstleutnant Egon Mayer, credited with 102 victories, and the pioneer of the head-on attack tactic against bombers, was killed on March 2, 1944. Oberst Wolf Dietrich Wilke, credited with 162 victories, was killed on March 23, possibly by Don Gentile and John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group. Walter Osau, credited with 127 victories, was killed on May 11th. The men flying the Mustangs were writing their own legends. George Preddy, of the 352nd Fighter Group, became the highest-scoring P-51 ace of the war, with 26.83 confirmed aerial victories. On August 6, 1944, nursing a hangover from a war bond party, Preddy shot down 6 Messerschmitt 109s in a single mission over Hamburg. Gun camera footage confirmed every kill. It was the European theatre single mission record. Preddy was tragically killed on Christmas Day, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. He was pursuing a Focke-Wulf 190 at treetop level when American anti-aircraft gunners, firing at the German aircraft, hit his P-51 instead. His brother William, also a Mustang pilot, was killed by anti-aircraft fire less than 4 months later over Czechoslovakia. Both brothers are buried side by side at Lorraine American Cemetery in France. Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group scored 21.83 total aerial victories, including 2 with the Royal Air Force before America entered the war. The son of Italian immigrants from Piqua, Ohio, Gentile lacked 2 years of college and could not join the United States Army Air Forces. Instead, he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force and eventually flew Spitfires with No. 133 Eagle Squadron. After converting to P-51Bs in February 1944, he scored approximately 15.5 kills in barely a month. On April 11, 1944, General Eisenhower personally visited his airfield and praised him as a one-man air force. Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group scored 11.5 aerial victories. On October 12, 1944, he became an ace in a day. His first two kills came without firing a shot when a panicking Messerschmitt 109 pilot broke into his wingman and both German pilots bailed out. 3 conventional kills followed. On November 6, 1944, Jaeger shot down a Messerschmitt 262 jet, catching it on its landing approach. His extraordinary 20/10 visual acuity and P-51 combat experience laid the foundation for his post-war career as a test pilot, culminating in breaking the sound barrier on October 14, 1947. Clarence Anderson, known as Bud, was a triple ace with 16.25 confirmed victories. He flew 116 combat missions across 2 tours and was never once hit by enemy fire, an almost statistically impossible achievement. All of his P-51s were named Old Crow after the bourbon whiskey. Anderson lived to 102 years old, becoming America's last surviving World War II triple ace before his death in May 2024. The definitive P-51D, with its distinctive bubble canopy, first flew on November 17, 1943. Its specifications represented the peak of piston-engined fighter development. Maximum speed reached 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling was 41,900 feet. Range with drop tanks extended to 1,650 miles. The aircraft was armed with 650 caliber machine guns carrying 1,880 rounds of ammunition. Against its contemporaries, the P-51D held the decisive advantage in range. The Messerschmitt 109G managed only about 528 miles on internal fuel. The Focke-Wulf 190A could fly roughly 500 to 560 miles. Even the Spitfire Mark 9 achieved only about 434 miles. In speed, the P-51D was fastest at combat altitudes at 437 miles per hour, compared to 398 for the Messerschmitt 109G6, 400 for the Focke-Wulf 190A8, and 409 for the Spitfire Mark 9. Total production reached approximately 15,586 aircraft across all variants. The P-51D alone accounted for 8,102 aircraft, the most widely produced variant. At roughly $50,000 per unit, it was significantly cheaper than the P-47 at over $80,000 or the B-17 at more than $200,000. P-51 pilots in the European theatre claimed approximately 4,950 aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, with thousands more destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. The P-51 accounted for roughly half of all American air-to-air victories in Europe, more than any other fighter type. The bomber loss rate transformation was stark. The 8th Air Force average monthly bomber loss rate dropped from 5.1% in 1943 to 1.9% in 1944. By summer 1944, the rate approached 1%. Crew survival probability for a 30-mission tour improved from roughly 1 in 4 in late 1943 to better than 70% by summer 1944. By June 6, 1944, the months of attrition had rendered the Luftwaffe virtually impotent over the invasion beaches. The German Air Force that had conquered Poland in days, that had swept the skies clear over France in 1940, that had terrorized Britain during the Blitz, could barely muster a token resistance against the greatest amphibious invasion in history. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Allied aircraft flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, and gliders filled the sky from the English coast to the Normandy beaches. The Luftwaffe managed approximately 319 sorties. The ratio was 46-1. For every German aircraft that took to the air, 46 Allied aircraft were already airborne. The most famous Luftwaffe action that day was the strafing run by Oberstleutnant Josef Priller, known as Pips, and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk in 2 Focke-Wulf 190s. Priller was a veteran ace with over 100 victories. He led his wingman down through the clouds, made a single firing pass over Sword Beach, and then fled for home. While other German units mounted scattered attacks throughout the day, the Luftwaffe's response was utterly inadequate against the scale of the invasion. 2 aircraft against an armada. Allied D-Day aircraft losses totaled 127, mostly to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe was simply not present in sufficient numbers to contest the landing. Admiral Friedrich Rüge, the naval advisor to Field Marshal Rommel, had written in his diary weeks earlier that numerous aircraft flew above them, but none of them were German. His observation proved prophetic. The connection between the Mustang's campaign and D-Day's success was direct and causal. Without the preceding 5 months of P-51-led attrition warfare, German fighter forces could have devastated the landing forces. Rommel himself assessed that overwhelming Allied air superiority meant large-scale movement of tanks would not be possible once the invasion was underway. The aircraft that the American military could not be bothered to test, fly in 1941, had become the instrument of the Luftwaffe's destruction. Redesignated F-51D in 1948, the Mustang returned to combat in the Korean War. Called back because early jet fighters lacked range from Japan and Korean, airfields were too rough for jets. Nearly 1,000 Mustangs served by 1951. The last American Mustangs were withdrawn from Air National Guard service in January 1957. The Dominican Republic retired the world's last military Mustangs in 1984. Today, approximately 311 complete P-51 airframes survive worldwide. This represents barely 1% of total production. Of these, roughly 160 remain airworthy, with 66 on static museum display and over 50 in active restoration. A flyable P-51D commands $2 to $4.5 million on today's market. Post-war surplus examples once sold for as little as $1,500. Key museum examples include the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, which has P-51D Willett Run being installed in its new World War II gallery opening in 2026, and P-51C Excalibur III at the Udvar Hazy Center. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson holds the very last Air National Guard Mustang, retired in 1957. Imperial War Museum, Duxford in England. Fittingly, the airfield where Ronnie Harker's 1942 test flight set the transformation in motion maintains flying examples. The Commemorative Air Force operates over 30 P-51s across multiple wings. The P-51 Mustang did not win World War II by itself. The Eastern Front consumed far more German resources. The P-47 Thunderbolt bore most of the early escort burden. The Royal Air Force night bombing campaign applied immense pressure. Soviet armies broke the Wehrmacht on the ground. But the Mustang solved a specific crisis at a critical moment. The daylight strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse in late 1943. Without a long-range escort fighter, it would have been abandoned. Without that campaign, German industry would have continued producing weapons at full capacity. Without air superiority, D-Day would have faced a fundamentally different threat environment. The Mustang achieved something no other aircraft could. It flew from England to Berlin and back. It fought at the altitudes where German interceptors operated. It killed Luftwaffe pilots faster than training schools could produce replacements. And it did all of this because two nations, in the midst of a desperate war, combined their best engineering traditions to create something neither could have built alone. Edgar Schmued, the self-taught immigrant who designed the airframe in 102 days, went on to design the F-86 Sabre and F-100 Super Sabre. He was inducted into the International Aerospace Hall of Fame in 1991, 6 years after his death. His life makes a powerful story in itself. A self-educated engineer from a defeated empire who created the weapon that defeated the ambitions of those who seized his native land. Dutch Kindelberger, the high school dropout who bet his company on an unproven design, led North American Aviation to produce more military aircraft than any other American manufacturer during the war. Approximately 42,000 aircraft rolled off North American production lines, including T-6 Texans, B-25 Mitchells, and P-51 Mustangs. The pilots who flew Mustangs into combat, men like Preddy and Gentile and Yeager and Anderson, faced odds that would be considered unacceptable by any modern military standard. They climbed into single-engine fighters, flew hundreds of miles over hostile territory, engaged an enemy that had years more experience, and returned to do it again the next day. Not all of them returned. American fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force suffered substantial casualties, but they broke the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. They cleared the skies for the bombers. They made D-Day possible. They won air superiority over Europe. The P-51 Mustang was rejected by its own nation, transformed by a foreign engine, and flown to victory by young men who would have been considered boys in peacetime. It was an improbable weapon forged in an improbable alliance, an American airframe mated to a British engine, designed by a German-born Austrian immigrant, built by workers from every corner of the United States, and flown against the air force of the nation where its designer was born. That is the story of how a rejected American fighter became the plane that broke the Luftwaffe. It is a story of desperation and defiance, of engineering brilliance and military stubbornness, of young men dying in the sky and changing the course of history. The Mustang did not fight alone, but it fought when it mattered most, in the skies where the war was decided. By the time Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, the battle for air superiority had already been won. The Mustang won it.